we're now much more concerned with matters of like, can a poor child go to Harvard? And I think elites today are genuinely much more concerned, even practically, with that than elites 300 years ago, where nobody cared about that. But I think that the sort of like unintended consequences, if you take this too far, and if you combine hypocrisy with it, you get this like absurd things where you deny any hierarchy and you're like, everyone is the same, everyone can be happy. It's sort of like toxic benevolence. It's like when a parent wants to be good to their children and they end up like not setting any boundaries, and then it's bad for the child. And so like I think it's the same with society and elites. I think it's good to have benevolent elites, and I think that's the core thing, the desire to be benevolent. But it's also very easy to just feel good about yourself and do nothing and not check the practical outcomes of your actions. In my experience, the vast majority of elites are so-called lazily well-intentioned.
And now, The Good Fight with Yascha Mounk.
My guest today is Ruxandra Teslo. Ruxandra is a PhD candidate in genomics at the Sanger Institute. But next to being a serious scientist, she is also a really interesting writer about culture. She entered the scene about a year ago with a Substack that has quickly gained a big and influential following. And she's written about all kinds of subjects we've discussed today, from her criticism of the concept of luxury beliefs to her argument that we should be skeptical about the concept of misinformation and the whole field in political science of misinformation studies, to her case for why we should think that culture really matters to political and social outcomes. Some of you will have heard about Ruxandra, in which case I'm sure you're excited to listen to this episode. Many of you perhaps will not yet have heard of her, but I promise you that she's a really important new voice and you'll enjoy our debate. And for our paying subscribers, we also have some bonus material this week. Ruxandra and I talked about how writers should think about the influence they have in the world and how all of us can assess whether or not we actually have a positive impact, how to think about how to lead an impactful life. That is part of the bonus materials for this week. Ruxandra Teslo, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, nice to see you again. And yes, I'm very excited to do this.
Me too. So listen, we started talking to each other in part because when I was trying to think through the concept of luxury beliefs that Rob Henderson has invented, but I think is very useful, but I also had some disagreements with it. You know, I Googled around for people who'd written on this, and I thought that you had the best response to it. But I've also been in conversation with you about other things, and you've really become an important voice on culture and science very, very quickly. So we'll start with a conversation about luxury beliefs, but I look forward to picking your brain on lots of other things. For listeners who may not have read my essay on this and who may not have listened to a conversation with Rob, what is the concept of luxury beliefs and why are you so critical of it?
Yeah, so the concept of luxury beliefs is this idea that elites have replaced material-based signaling status with material means. So, for example, people used to like have very expensive clothes to signal their elite status. And the idea is that they have replaced, especially in recent times, they have replaced this with signaling via beliefs. And such a belief, for example, like one that Rob gives very often is defund the police, right? So the idea is that there are these like fancy beliefs that are more common among like, let's say, upper middle class, educated, often white people. And, obviously, it's pretty clear that Rob considers them mistaken. And to be honest, I also consider a lot of them very mistaken. But I think where we disagree is that I don't really agree with how he portrays the motivation of elites in holding these often misguided beliefs.
And so what is it about the motivation that you think is mistaken? Is it just sort of what he ascribes to people who hold those luxury beliefs? Is it the kinds of things that he includes under the heading of luxury beliefs? Sort of how big and important is this disagreement?
Yeah, so I think the main thing that we agree on is, first of all, that a lot of these beliefs are mistaken. And I think we also agree on the fact that it's easier to hold mistaken beliefs when you don't face the consequences of it, which is what you're basically saying. But there are several things where I disagree with. So first of all, I'm not sure that we can observe that there was a shift in how elites signal status from the past compared to now in like this fundamental way. I think elites have always used a combination of complex things to signal status. And I also think this varies to some extent by elite. Like financial elites pretty much still signal using money and their compensation and stuff. And in the past, and equally so, in the past, a lot of elites also signaled using behavioral norms and using sort of, what you would consider immaterial, non-material signs of status. And that's where the concept of nouveau-riche comes from. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, but that's like 19th century social novels. There's always a character who's like rich, but they don't really fit into the elite groups because they don't have the right manners, they don't have the right maybe even opinions. So that's why they need to marry someone from an old family that would give them some respectability. So I think there's sort of like an empirical disagreement there. I also think that elites, maybe to the extent that some elites today signal less with material means, they do still signal with achievements. So, for example, you could say that academics, journalists, maybe even tech bros aren't big into like wearing fancy clothes, but they still signal a lot with achievements, like who publishes the better paper, the most cited paper, who has raised more money for their startup, even if they're dressed in like really ugly clothing and cheap clothing. And the reason why these material and sort of achievement-based signaling methods are still, in my opinion, primary is because they have something that is very important for something to properly function as a status signal. They are scarce. Beliefs are not as scarce as achievements and as material stuff. Anyone can say they want to defund the police. Now, I do believe that the way in which you say it, and also, the way in which you say it, and can sort of show that you're part of a certain group of people, and it also maybe is not as much status, but like just to be accepted within a group of elite people. But when it comes to academics ranking each other between themselves and or like tech people or whatever, they rely a lot on achievements and maybe less on material stuff for academics and specifically. So I think there's an empirical disagreement there.
Okay, so let's back up a couple of steps here, right? So I think your disagreement with Rob is primarily about the sort of imputation of a certain kind of motivation behind these luxury beliefs, right? So let's say there is these sets of ideas like defund the police. Let us grant that there's something pernicious about them. And I think what Rob is trying to do, what you're trying to do in a way, what I was trying to do in my response to Rob, is to really spell out what the problem with those beliefs is, what defines the class of beliefs and what the problem with it is. Now, where you and I agree is that Rob sometimes imputes a kind of ill will to the people who hold these luxury beliefs in a way that is mistaken, right? So there's a really interesting passage in his memoir, which is excellent, which I recommend to everybody, but that I think is sort of going wrong in a small way, where he says, all these people who claim that, who at Yale with him, who claim that capitalism is a terrible political system, and then they all end up working for Goldman Sachs. And he explains this in part among some of them as, well, perhaps they realize that the more they go around saying that capitalism is evil, the fewer of their classmates are going to apply to Goldman Sachs, and so therefore they're going to have less competition, right? And I just don't think that that's how that mechanism works. People persuade themselves that they're going to change the place from the inside, or that they'll work there for a few years and give all the money away as effective altruists, or any number of other reasons, and then they just end up being capitalists. But that kind of slightly conspiratorial assumption that perhaps they're really just trying to mislead people in this way, I think is mistaken. And the same way, sometimes there's people that claim, the reason you pointed this out, why rich people, the reason why really smart people think that others could easily understand the things they understand is to, somehow devalue how they actually work, when really the reason is just that if you're around very smart people, it's easy to forget how less smart people view and process the world, right? We both are really united in being very nervous about any kind of conspiratorial element in this definition. Now, what I did in my essay was to say, all right, let's get rid of that element, right? And let's just define luxury beliefs more narrowly as the kind of beliefs that you're holding in part because, given your social position, you haven't really had to deal properly with the consequences of this, right? That doesn't mean that you want other people to suffer. Certainly doesn't mean it's part of a conspiracy. It just means, if you come from an affluent neighborhood and you're sitting around at a college campus where there's campus police keeping you safe, pretty easy to think, well, don't police go wrong in many important ways in America? And wouldn't the solution be just to abolish the damn thing? Now, what I hear you saying now is a sort of slightly different pushback, right? Which is around the kind of social status that people supposedly try to gain from luxury beliefs, right? Where you're saying, well, look, part of the point of luxury beliefs, or the very name of it, is a contrast to the idea of luxury goods. Right, that rather than showing how fancy you are by serving the most expensive champagne and caviar, you are sort of appropriating these beliefs to show how sort of fancy and progressive you are. And I guess I'll have two responses to the very smart critique I think you're making here. Right, one is that luxury beliefs become particularly important in a context where the other things are roughly equal. Right. So one response I had to your essay in mine was to say, look, if you have the fancy lawyer that sends the kid to private school and he's talking to somebody with an average office job, they don't need to use the luxury beliefs to show that they have superior social status. They'll just show off with a fancy job and with the fact that they send their kid to the best private school. But when you're at a school fundraiser in which a fancy lawyer is talking to a fancy doctor whose child goes to the same school, well, then perhaps these luxury beliefs are a much more useful form of social competition, right? So among people who are of roughly equal status, it's particularly powerful. And by the way, one area that's obviously true is in grad school, right? Where you're like both before the time when you can have real achievements, you're both insecure about your status. And so embracing these kind of political views becomes a particularly tempting thing to do. So I think that tracks with where they tend, where we see some of the worst cases of those kind of luxury beliefs. So what do you think about sort of that way of understanding the nature of a social competition? That it's it's particularly present when there's other things that are doubtless also important, are less present, and so they can distinguish between people who are otherwise at similar levels of social prestige.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And actually, this made me think that sometimes it's used by people who are maybe very similar to each other in status, but one of them feels a bit inferior in some way. And then they sort of morally make the person who's a bit above them, but very subtly, feel morally guilty through some sort of like virtue signaling that they do. Like, let's say the fancy doctor is a bit poorer than the fancy lawyer, just completely, hypothetical. But then the fancy doctor is like, yeah, but see, I don't work for the evil capitalists. I do like this like very sort of benevolent thing that is medicine that has nothing to do with capital, which is obviously not true. But I could see that happening, especially when there's like a sort of a small differential in status. And I think, but very small, sort of perceptible only to elite. So I think that's a very good point. And I definitely think this is happening. And I think people have very mixed ways of signaling status. I think and it kind of shifts a lot based on circumstance and based on the differential and based on what people around you that you want to prove your status to are, can perceive and can appreciate. I guess my only point is simply that, yeah, what I said is that like this has always been the case. And it doesn't seem obvious to me that elites today are more virtue signaling or more holding more wrong beliefs just for the sake of social status than they used to.
That's a really interesting point. Let's talk about that for a moment, right? So I think undoubtedly allegiance to a certain set of beliefs is an in-group marker in many different contexts and societies, right? This can be a theological idea. If you want to be part of the ruling elite of Iran today, you have to profess not only being a devout Muslim, but probably being a particular kind of devout Muslim with a particular kind of set of practices that perhaps puts you apart from less religious fellow citizens you have. That was the case in ancient Rome with various ideas you were expected to hold as a member of the elite. I wonder, though, whether there's something particular about the set of ideas that are popular in many elite circles today, which are a strange mix of sort of high-minded idealism that claimed to be altruistic in a way that was not true of the mainstream culture of European aristocrats for many centuries, who I think quite openly would have said, we live in a fair social hierarchy and we're at the top of it. And while we have concern for our peasants, it's fine, but we're better than them, right? And perhaps the additional fact that not only do they claim to be high-minded and idealistic, but then actually they don't end up having positive consequences for the people who they supposedly serve. Now, I'm not saying that our moment is the only moment in which something like that would be true. And I actually think that part of the utility of luxury beliefs is that they could, in theory, be applied to a society 500 years ago as well as today, and they absolutely should be applied about left-wing ideas, about right-wing ideas, not just about left-wing ideas. So Rob often uses them to criticize certain kinds of left-wing ideas he disagrees with. I think in other contexts, we might be able to use them to criticize all kinds of right-wing ideas that are misguided. One example I give is about, we don't really need state-provided healthcare because perhaps you're not exposed to what the consequences of that would be, right? But it does feel like, descriptively, this concept of luxury beliefs gets at a larger share of how the kind of progressive left-leaning cultural elite in America today operates than how the elite 50 years ago in America operates. But there's all kind of pernicious beliefs, but they weren't really luxury beliefs of the same sort, or that an aristocrat in the 18th century believed, who held things that much worse than the luxury beliefs of the American elite today. But they weren't luxury beliefs because they didn't have this element of claiming to be idealistic in a way that simultaneously is completely oblivious about the fact that it actually would have negative consequences for the people it pretends to have positive consequences for.
Yeah, no, I also agree with that. So I think that I think what has happened. So I was disputing here more narrowly that signaling via beliefs is something that has changed in prevalence recently. But I do think there is some. I mean, obviously, this concept hasn't become so popular for nothing. It hits at something, and I think what we're trying here to do is to not completely dismiss it, but actually sort of try to perfect it through debate. So I think that what it hits at is right. Maybe the proportion of signaling with beliefs hasn't changed, but the kind of popular beliefs that are used to signal status has changed. And I do believe that because of changes that could be considered overall good, for example, we're much more egalitarian, and ideas that are sort of egalitarian have become much more popular in our culture compared to aristocrats who didn't even pretend they believe in egalitarianism. I think that if you take that too far, you arrive at this almost denial of any sort of hierarchy that exists. And for aristocratic beliefs, for aristocratic people in the past, they might have, showed, they might use beliefs as religiousness or liking the king or having some sort of very aristocratic, very elitist manners. Whereas now, because egalitarianism is sort of the chic sort of idea, which is in many ways good, when it's taken too far, it leads to this sort of weird hypocrisy in elites, where they have to pretend, where they go too far in pretending that everything is super egalitarian. I think this might serve to some extent a role. So I think we're now much more concerned with matters of can a, poor child go to Harvard? And I think elites today are genuinely much more concerned, even practically, with that than elites 300 years ago, where nobody cared about that. But I think that the sort of unintended consequences, if you take this too far, and if you combine hypocrisy with it, you get this absurd things where you deny any hierarchy and you're everyone is the same, everyone can be happy. It's sort of like toxic benevolence. It's when a parent wants to be good to their children and they end up not setting any boundaries, and then it's bad for the child. And so I think it's the same with society and elites. I think it's good to have benevolent elites, and I think that's the core thing, the desire to be benevolent. But it's also very easy to just feel good about yourself and do nothing and not check the practical outcomes of your actions. So that's what I would say, that yes, there is a clear shift in the types of signaling with beliefs that elites do. Where I still disagree with Rob, and I think this is what you brought up very, very correctly, is that I don't think these things are as thought out and as like conspiratorial as some of the examples might show. In my experience, the vast majority of elites are so-called lazily well-intentioned. They're generally well-intentioned. They genuinely hate things they genuinely want to support people in the moment, but they won't do like extensive research to find out how do you actually help poor people. And this is kind of the premise of effective altruism, right? Like people do want to do good, but they just don't want to spend the mental energy. And then the elites just resort to whatever is cool and popular in their circles. And I think, and one of them might be defund the police, but they don't go on the ground and see, does defunding the police actually help these people? They just hear defund the police. They hear some arguments that sound high-minded, and they're like, yeah, let's defund the police. And I think it's the same with capitalism. And like my experience with colleagues that were denouncing capitalism was not that they were trying to undermine anyone. It's more like they generally didn't like capitalism, but then they didn't think too much about it. It was just like a nice thing to say, made you friends, whatever.
They don't like capitalism because there's negative elements to capitalism, and they've never taken the time to actually think about what would be the negative elements of socialism, what would be the negative elements of alternative systems of governing our economy, and would those be on the whole preferable? And so I think that's right. Two thoughts that this inspires in me. I mean, one is, I think there's two different ways of reading elites being lazily benevolent, which is, I think, is a really fortuitous turn of phrase. It's a really lovely way of putting it. I think there's the kind of more generous reading of that and the less generous reading of that. And it's worth having both in mind, right? Like, one is elites genuinely care. They genuinely want the best for other people, even at their own expense, but they're too lazy to think through what it would take to actually make those changes or improvements. And I think that's sometimes valid. I would say that there's also a kind of less generous reading of that, which is that they're lazily and limitedly benevolent, which is to say, yeah, they want good things for people in general, but part of the laziness comes from the fact that they're not motivated to spend that much time or effort on that, and that they don't want to give up their own status in society and well-being. And so what they'll adopt is views which allow them to square feeling benevolent and thinking that they're doing something good in society without having to give up status and without having to give up material well-being. And many of the kind of state of beliefs that we end up with in society are kind of cultural beliefs rather than economic beliefs. So you end up with, racism is the original sin of the United States and all white people are racist. But all that means, since all white people are racist, is that kind of there's not much distinction between them. And, every now and again you go to an anti-racist workshop and feel bad about yourself, but you don't actually have to give up your money, right? I'm slightly caricaturing, right? But I think there is a kind of, no, perhaps you would say I'm in danger of saying something sort of conspiratorial. I don't think that is conspiratorial, right? To think that people are going to be driven, everybody is the hero in their own story. Everybody is the hero in their own movie, but they're going to find the narrative that allows them to be the hero in their own story, in their own movie. And then they genuinely believe in the things that allow them to have this positive self-perception, even if inquiring more seriously into that belief would lead them to say something more negative. The other thought that what you were saying inspired me was to think about the fact that luxury beliefs are actually perhaps characteristic of democracy. So I have an argument more in the political context that populism is really a feature of democracy. People sometimes ask me, is Xi Jinping a populist? And that's because populism has become this kind of slightly vague all-purpose phrase that can denote somebody who's authoritarian. And certainly Xi Jinping is a dictator. He's certainly not democratically elected. But part of populism is an anti-elitist vein that doesn't really make sense if you are the person in charge in a highly bureaucratic state where the governing party has called the shots for 100 years. So it really is a fundamental category mistake to think that Nikita Khrushchev was a populist or that Xi Jinping is a populist. No, they are anti-pluralist. They believe that they are at the top of a hierarchy and that's a good thing for their country and for their society. But they're not anti-elitist because they see themselves as the rightful elite, which is a very different kind of attitude. Now, in a kind of parallel way, I think, going back to the 18th century aristocrat, he's not going to have luxury beliefs because he doesn't feel the pressure to pretend that his beliefs need to be justified by how they serve the common people. Now, he may have a story about why the social order is legitimate and why even peasants should acquiesce to it and why it's all part of God's will or something like that. But that sort of specific pressure to say, the way I think is really in the interest of the least advantaged, of the downtrodden, of the subaltern, that's a pressure that elites are going to feel much more strongly in a democracy than in a non-democracy. And so therefore the prevalence of luxury beliefs is likely to be much higher in a deeply democratic culture and society than in a different kind of culture and society. I think we've teased out a lot of interesting things about luxury belief. Do we have a kind of consensus? I mean, it feels to me like we think there is a useful concept of luxury beliefs. We shouldn't overemphasize the extent to which it's in competition with luxury goods and achievements, but all still matter very much as a marker of social status. We need to be very wary about imputing a kind of conspiratorial element to the people who hold those. But if we take care to do those things, then perhaps it continues to be a useful concept. Or what do you think is the takeaway from this part of the conversation?
So I just wanted to, first of all, agree 100% with you regarding the democracy and luxury beliefs being more prevalent in democracy. Some might say that it's almost like it's a feature, not a bug, because basically you need to voice being more extreme than you actually are to some extent in order to maintain something that is at a lower level. Like elites needed to be more to show how religious they were in order to maintain religion. And it's the same here. In order to maintain democracy, maybe you need to exaggerate how egalitarian you are. So that's one point that I totally agree with. And obviously you shouldn't take it too far and so on, that we agree with, and it leads to like a lot of dysfunction if you do and so on. But then, yes, I basically agree with your description and about what we have concluded. And I think whether we can continue to use the term as such, as luxury beliefs, a term is never like, the words don't matter per se, it's about what people attach meaning to. And my personal observation is that a lot of, I am on Twitter quite a lot. I feel like a lot of people have attached it to like this sort of semi-conspiratorial view, like, oh, this person actually wants something bad to happen to these people, but they will pretend they don't and they have a luxury belief. I think we can continue to use the term, but the fact that it has transmutated and has started to be used in this way has to be kept in mind. And it might be that just because of that, there needs to be a new term. I don't know, but it's just something to keep in mind. I don't think the term in itself is right or wrong. It's about how it has ended up being used by people.
And that, I think, is often a complicated tactical or strategic question. I don't mean tactical or strategic in terms of achieving some political goal. I just mean in terms of sort of intellectual honesty or in terms of having a sensible debate, which is, but every term is going to be misused sometimes. So every term is going to have connotations that are misleading. And so sort of, are the connotations now so misleading that the term has become useless, or should we fight for the better definition or the true definition of a term? Is always going to be this kind of tactical question in a particular discourse that's going to be really hard to answer. And so I think, perhaps our disagreement is ultimately less about the substance of this phenomenon in the social world than about sort of how contaminated that concept has become by ill users and what the tactical response to it should be. So that's helped me understand the nature of where we agree and where we disagree. Let me broaden this out a little bit. I mean, you talked about your colleagues dismissing capitalism without thinking about it very much, and I know that is one of the kinds of topics that is personal to you as somebody who is born in Romania and still has a real sense of the sort of legacy of communism and socialism there. You're a nice science PhD student, working on serious things that have nothing to do with Twitter debates and nothing to do with culture wars about luxury beliefs and so on. I have to say that about a year ago, I had not heard of you, and I think most people had not heard of you. And then very quickly, you've been able to build a significant following with what I think are really great essays at your Substack. What made you enter this set of debates? Why do you think it's important for you, with your background, to engage in these conversations? And what's your sort of unique point of view about why these cultural debates matter? To somebody whose primary identity, I think, still is as a scientist.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your kind words. And that's a very good question. I think it's a combination of things. So first of all, I've always been interested in these like sort of more like humanities related questions. I've always read a lot of literature, read philosophy in school. I did the Olympiads, and I did both sciences and philosophy and literature and stuff like that. In 7th grade, I was I think at the time, the only kid that qualified for both the National Physics and Literature Olympiad. So I always had this like dual nature. So there's an interest there. And then secondly, I wrote this piece. It's called How I Stopped Being a Culture Incel. And it was about how, as a scientist, I realized that even the extent to which people value science itself and progress and everything is in itself dependent on culture. And I started to read a lot about the Enlightenment and how, like, sort of, there's this historian called economic historian called Deirdre McCloskey, who I really like, and she talks a lot about how a lot of what spurred the Enlightenment wasn't just material factors per se. It was also how people related to the idea of progress. Like, they started to talk about progress in a positive light. So I think you can't really separate in some ways the two. And I just saw how people were, against markets, against capitalism, and as you say, as an Eastern European who has seen how hard it is to do science and how hard it is to progress in a country that is communist or post-communist even, is as I've seen that, I was like, no, like all of the stuff that we're doing here, all of the drugs that we're interested in, we're doing more basic biology in my lab, but like just in general, when you talk to academics, it's like all of the stuff that is exciting in human health and so on, it is underpinned by this machinery that really doesn't work under socialism. And I think the third reason is just one of my first essays was some issues that I had with misinformation research. And I think the fact that I'm not part of the humanities sphere and the fact that I don't do social science or whatever meant that I could just criticize this concept quite freely. I mean, people still commented on it or like, why are you saying this? But it doesn't really affect my career in any meaningful way. Like, I can just leave. Whereas I feel like a lot of humanities people feel like they can't speak about things that they have a problem with because it'll directly impact their career. So I think it was also this opportunity. So I think there are three things. It's interest, it's just my experience with post-socialism and socialism, and how I think progress is impacted by culture, and how the culture is it's a bit turning against progress maybe. And then the third one is just, maybe I don't have as much to lose as people who are in humanities.
Thank you so much for listening to The Good Fight. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Now, I know from the numbers that some of you listening right now are paying subscribers to my Substack or to Persuasion, and I'm very grateful to you for that. And yet you are currently listening to the free version of the podcast, the version that has ads that can be annoying, the version that doesn't include the bonus material at the end of this week's conversation, for example, and the version that makes you miss out on our bonus features like the new monthly mailbag in which I answer your questions. So if that is the case for you, you can fix that by doing one of two things. Either you go to the last email you received from me, because hopefully you're subscribed to my Substack, the last email about a podcast, and you click on Set Up Podcast and you follow those instructions. Or alternatively, you simply navigate to the following webpage. Head to yaschamounk.substack.com/listen. That is yaschamounk.substack.com/listen. And if you don't get this content per email as well, you're missing out on my weekly written columns about big ideas. In the last few weeks, for example, I've had a series of articles about how to evaluate effective altruism and the 4 big myths that are misleading people in how to think about the current election. So go add the private feed of this podcast. Become a paying subscriber if you want access to that content, and be sure to receive my weekly written essays in your inbox as well. Thank you for listening. This tees up a number of things I want to ask you about based on your writing. So the first is this concept of misinformation, and listeners to this podcast will know that I'm also quite skeptical of that concept. There is clearly a lot of lies in social media. There's a lot of deliberate propaganda that is meant to mislead people. Absolutely people have misapprehensions about important things based on what they read in social media. And yet I've always been worried that this term is so vague that it can come to mean all kinds of things. And some of the principal examples of how the term of misinformation has been applied in the last years really don't augur very well. So the term misinformation was used in order to shut down any genuine debate about the origin of the COVID virus in the middle of a pandemic. It was used to describe reports about Hunter Biden's laptop, which turned out to be accurate. So what is your beef with this field of study, and how should we talk about the world of what is true and what is false, what is lies and what isn't? We need some set of words to have these conversations, to have these debates. If misinformation is not it, how should we talk about this instead?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to say that I think in some ways the field suffers from a bit of hubris, right? Hubris. Like people since the dawn of time have tried to, discover what truth is, right? That's why philosophers emerged. That's why science emerged. It's trivially true that it's good to care about the truth, but what people discovered is that it's not that easy to discover the truth, especially if people have a lot of biases. We have limited understanding. World is very complex and so on. So a lot of groups in society want to discover truth, and a lot of people historically want to discover truth. To me, saying that you're a misinformation expert is almost like saying that I've established a truth ministry. Like I am the minister of truth. Like, how?
This is underlined by the fact that often the people who bill themselves as misinformation journalists in their jobs, then on social media and sometimes in their articles spread things that are falsifiably wrong. So the people who claim to be expert in it have a pretty bad track record of avoiding spreading what they would call misinformation themselves.
Yeah, 100%. So I think that's the other thing. I think it's exactly right what you said. So I think often people use this to feel good about themselves, like, oh, I'm the arbiter of truth. And it can very easily be weaponized as for specific political goals, even with the people being unconscious. Like, I don't believe in conspiracies. I don't think these people are evil. I think they generally probably believe in their mission. But I think it's very, very easy to lie to yourself that you are some sort of arbiter of truth when you call yourself a misinformation expert. And you're completely right. Like there have been so many scandals, and people often make jokes about this. Like, oh, you're another misinformation expert. Like, of course, they lied about in their CVs. Like there was this BBC misinformation expert that was caught lying on her CV and stuff like that. And I think what is important for people to realize is that we're all fallible in our intellect, and what we actually need is good institutions, and institutions that people can trust, that are in a constant process of self-criticism and sort of self-discovery and discovering new things. And I think a lot of the times the misinformation label actually serves to make these institutions lazier because they feel good about themselves, because they show a lot of the tactics employed in these misinformation studies things is to show something completely stupid, like something on Breitbart, which is absolutely crazy. And in my opinion, that makes elites feel good about themselves. I am so much smarter. What we actually need is to be harsher on elites. And I guess here I'm agreeing with Rob. We need to be harsher on elites. We need elites to be self-correcting. We need universities to be self-correcting. The standard that we need to hold universities to is not the standard that we hold Breitbart to. And what universities need to do and what our intellectual institutions need to do, journalism, universities, is to be as correct as possible in order to increase trust. And that is going to be much more important for people not believing in the crazy conspiracy theories on Breitbart. When institutions prove themselves capable and when trust in institutions increases. And the problem that I think is the root of misinformation is not misinformation per se, because untruth will always exist. It's the crisis in trust that we see in society. The trust in institutions has dropped a lot, particularly among Republicans, but also among Democrats. If you look at Gallup surveys of trust in universities, it has dropped a lot. So I think what intellectuals need to do is to face the truth that there have been failures. There have been some miscommunications around how impactful lockdowns will be for children that now everyone accepts, but at the time, major institutions, use this like, oh, you're a misinformation spreader, you hate you hate the teachers, you want nothing, no harm will come to children, and now it proves that there was harm done to children. Again, the COVID origins, I don't really have a very great opinion on that debate, even though it's scientific. I haven't looked into it very deeply, but it doesn't seem right to me to call someone a conspiracy theorist for advancing a theory. And that was done a lot by misinformation researchers. So I think that the failures of institutions were not being self-critical enough and just feeling good about themselves, like, oh, I'm so much better than the plebs. And the right way to approach this is not to label some things as misinformation is super blatant, but I think what at least needs to do is to do some soul searching and think about how do we increase trust. And that includes decreasing what Matthew Iglesias calls elite misinformation. So elites within themselves believe in false things, and they might be much more sophisticated. They won't sound like Breitbart. They won't sound like crazy conspiracy theories, but they do believe false things.
What are some examples of elite misinformation?
I remember during COVID, when the lockdowns were implemented, Emily Oster, who was an economist, and she was the one who said that, look, we have to think about closing schools because the harm to children seems to be quite low from COVID, and but the harm to their development and education could be very large, especially for disadvantaged children. And I remember at the time she was like absolutely, she was super criticized on Twitter. People told her that she wants people to die, all this like very emotional, and other elites. So not like random people. So I think that was an example of elite misinformation. People said that it's absolutely clear that they were very confident there won't be another harm. I saw recently on Twitter this study that was very popular at the time about how having a white doctor makes minority babies die at higher rates or something like that. And people, because it sounded, in line with liberal ideas, people super propagated it, but it turns out it was based on a statistical flaw, and there was a good debunking of it. And now basically most people accept that it was flawed. So stuff like that.
That's a fascinating paper. My understanding of that debate is that it is true that Black newborns die at higher rates when they're treated by white doctors. But the reason for this turns out, upon closer examination, that when there is a greater health challenge to the baby, a white doctor is more likely to treat it, right? So perhaps because of some background facts in American society, more senior doctors are more likely to be white, or major hospital centers are more likely to have more white doctors. And so, when you have a birth where there's no risk to the baby and no particular concerns, it's more likely to be treated by a Black doctor. When you have medical circumstances where the risk to the baby is much, much higher, it's more likely to be a white doctor. And so once you control for background facts about the health of the baby that is being treated, it turns out that there's not increased mortality rates for babies treated by white doctors. And of course, one of the strange things in these kinds of debates is that is good news, right? We should have been really, really shocked by the fact that supposedly white doctors just don't care about Black babies as much. And everybody who cares about social justice, everybody who cares about building a generally equal society should be overjoyed by the fact that this turns out to have been a statistical artifact or an artifact of a bad study design. And instead in the debate, it's kind of the opposite, right? Where the people who claim to care most about social justice seem to lament the fact that one of their favorite talking points has now been sort of taken away in this strange way. Let me make two broader points here. One is, as you were talking, I was starting to think that the term misinformation is actually surprisingly the equivalent of a term problematic. So this was sort of a bugbear of mine for a long time. I feel like people use the word problematic a little bit less than they did in the mid-2010s, when it really kind of came into very common usage. I may be wrong about that. That's just my sense. And it was this very vague, all-purpose way of disqualifying something, right? I can say, this is problematic. I'm not going to explain to you why it's problematic. I'm not going to make a case against it. I'll just put it under this general pole of suspicion with a word that imputes badness without actually requiring me to explain or justify the badness of a thing to which I'm applying the label. And I think misinformation, sort of, if problematic is a openly normative term, misinformation is a kind of factual equivalent of it, right? I can say, oh, this is you make a political argument I don't like, that's just misinformation, right? Like, I don't have to justify why it's misinformation. I don't have to explain it. I don't have to be rigorous about it. I can just apply this label in this kind of vague, dismissive way, and it's a way of undermining that narrative. I wonder where we should go a step further. You said perhaps sometimes misinformation is a useful term. I'm wondering whether it basically reduces into its sub-components, right? So sometimes something is a lie. And when somebody is lying, we shouldn't say they're peddling misinformation. If we know that they know that it's wrong, then they are telling a lie, and that's what we should say. Sometimes they may be spreading a falsehood. Perhaps we don't know that they are deliberately spreading this falsehood, but we can show, they say there's a storm yesterday in Rome, Italy, and in fact, there wasn't a storm in Rome, Italy. That is a falsehood. It's not misinformation. We can express that very straightforwardly. I think there's some use for the term disinformation for when a government entity or some very clear entity is deliberately spreading some kind of narrative, right? So I think it's fine to say, Twitter accounts controlled by a particular government are spreading deliberate lies. And that is a form of collective, of organized disinformation. We have to be careful about how to use this term because I think it can spread too far, but I recognize that as a category of social phenomenon that it might be useful to have a term for. But once we have these terms, I don't know whether the term misinformation actually retains any usefulness at all. So perhaps we should reject it. And the particular reason for that is that I think the most common use for misinformation nowadays is not about factual claims. It's basically about, quote-unquote, narratives, which is to say, often political conclusions that people don't like, right? So you might say, the fact, the idea that immigration is leading to a lot of problems in Europe is misinformation. And that claim may or may not be right, but it is a political judgment based on a variety of political facts. And you can say, I disagree with that conclusion. Here are the reasons to think that actually immigration as a whole is a good thing. But misinformation is just a way of saying, that political conclusion is problematic for reasons I'm not going to spell out.
No, that's a very good point. And to the immigration thing, I think there are two categories. I think we have a very good example. If you remember, there was Trump spreading the idea, and a lot of people on social media that immigrants were eating dogs and cats.
They're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the pets of the people who live there. He is a poet of the English language, especially when he's spreading lies, which I think is what you're about to say.
Yeah, so this is demonstrably, I was very, I wrote a post about it, about how it's a lie, and it's obviously a very noxious lie. My understanding is that some immigrants in that town were in danger at some point because of threats that were made towards them. And it's just, ridiculous. People had a bounty for someone who could indicate a Haitian immigrant that actually ate dogs and cats, and they couldn't even find one person with certainty that did that. There was just these weird videos online that weren't even clear, and we didn't know if they were Haitian immigrants or whatever. Just like this person pretending that they saw this guy roasting some animals that might have been cats or dogs. So it was a complete fiasco, and we can safely say that was lying. Right? We have a word for that. That was lying. It's blatant lying, and it's bad, and it doesn't help us understand the phenomenon better. It breeds hate, and yeah, we have a word for it, lying, and we also have a word for the sentiment that it breeds. It's hate and prejudice. But then there's another aspect to it, which is immigration in general, as you said, is immigration good or bad? That's a value judgment. It depends on a lot of factors. Maybe people in Springfield, maybe immigration is bad for them because if there are a lot of newcomers into a town and the town doesn't have time to adapt to that, maybe there's just something some locals don't like for various reasons that have nothing to do with cats and dogs and hate and whatever. I don't know because I haven't been there. I haven't talked to enough people. It's something that I obviously am sort of roughly pro-immigration. I'm quite a pro-immigration person, but I would never, dismiss someone's sort of experience as outright misinformation if they are in very different circumstances. I mean, because it's a value judgment, as you say, it's a political question, it's a value judgment, it varies a lot by where you are, by the specifics of the situation, and it's something that I think should be understood as opposed to decried as misinformation. So I think you're probably right. Like we have words, we have the word lie, maybe organized disinformation as well. If let's say a foreign power was organizing eating dog and cat, propaganda videos. And then we have political opinions and moral opinions that, as you say, the term misinformation is often used to sort of dismiss them outright.
The other major thing you said when I asked you about how you got into being a public writer and commentator was about the threat to the deeper culture that sustains a lot of our progress. Why should we be optimistic about our collective ability to make genuine progress? And to what extent do you think the social norms and the institutions that actually support and underwrite that progress are actually under threat these days?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a tough question to answer because we don't have that much reference points to compare it to, right? Like we've only had this sort of modern framework for less than 200 years, maybe even less than that, 100 years. Like this whole idea of open inquiry being very important, having institutions dedicated to it. Sort of liberalism was sort of born as a coherent ideology, spelled as such, was born in the 19th century. I think it's hard to have a comparison, worse compared to when. I do think that it is probably more under threat than 30 years ago. And I think that, but I still think there are reasons to be optimistic. And the reasons to be optimistic is that I do believe that this appreciation for freedom is, at this point, somewhat embedded into the psyche of a lot of our cultures. And I also think that unlike maybe 40 years ago, we have more technological means to achieve it. So, for example, it's much harder to have centralized control over the media. For example, Substack is a method of doing that. Substack is a way in which anyone can just share their opinion. So it's much harder to completely take someone from the public sphere, take someone out. So, but of course, that comes with challenges. A lot of people spreading lies, to not use the word misinformation, they come up with less gatekeeping. And again, the solution for that is to support institutions becoming stronger and more reliable so that the people writing on Substack are just additions, and maybe someone goes to find someone particularly interesting, but doesn't become a hotbed of conspiracy theory. But I think whether that will happen or not is dependent much more on how healthy institutions will be.
How much progress do we think we have now? There's this debate about whether progress has slowed down, whether when you look at the kind of technological transformation that you've had in the world from, let's say, 1940 to 1980, there's been similarly fast progress from 1980 to 2020. How should we think about the speed of progress in the background culture, and what can we do to increase that speed? And why should we increase that speed?
Thank you. So I think I have this I have this belief that a lot of our current luxuries, both moral and physical, but particularly moral, are afforded because of technological progress. I don't want to think what would happen if we were again under a sort of scarcity regime, like a Malthusian regime, where, throughout history, people really didn't have an abundance of food, really did have to fight for resources. We don't really have to do that anymore because it's very hard to die of actual hunger in the US, of actual hunger. I know people struggle with food security and stuff, but famine was a thing throughout history. So I think that a lot of our benevolence and even the sort of hypocritical benevolence that elites can afford to show is underpinned by the fact that we don't really need to we have a lot of these luxuries. We're not living in a scarcity world. Women's liberation was very underpinned by medical innovations like the contraceptive pill. And I think in the future, reproductive health for women is going to be very important for further expanding self-determination. So I think a lot of the things that people of very different political stripes care about are ultimately underpinned by technological progress. So that's why we should want to have it.
I have a slightly tongue-in-cheek theory about the differences between squirrels in Europe and the United States, or for that matter, between deer in Europe and the United States, because I think anybody who comes from Europe and goes to the United States is really struck by the fact that they're quite tame and they're not very shy and that they, just aren't afraid of humans. And I think it's because America has been affluent for long enough and had probably rules governing hunting and other things for long enough that there has been much less evolutionary pressure on these animals in the United States. The shy ones survived, whereas in Europe there's been enough famine within recent memory that, the ancestors of these animals that weren't sufficiently shy passed away because they were eaten. So I'm not sure how serious I am about this theory, but I think sort of the systematic impact of progress on our moral universe certainly I think is being underestimated. What does that have to do with the role of women? You've written one article arguing that if a pro-progress side is going to win, it needs to convince women in a different kind of way. How are these two phenomena, these two ideas related?
First of all, I think in the same way that I think that people are lazily well-intentioned and adopt the view somewhat passively, I think that everyone is influenced a lot by aesthetics when considering what to believe in. So it's not about most of the time it's not about careful consideration. It's about the aesthetics of the people who propagate ideas, and it's about the aesthetics of the ideas, how the ideas are framed. So I think that, so that's one thing. And then the second thing, I think women are very important in propagating culture. And I don't really think that you can have a mainstream cultural movement, and I don't think you can have a healthy cultural movement without women participating. Even at pro-progress conferences that I was, it was a lot of women organizing them, a lot of women volunteering their time, and they make a huge boost. So you don't want to lose this support. I also think it's good for women themselves, but even like if you're completely selfish and if you are just like, I want to advance pro-progress ideas, I think it's good for you to attract as many women as possible. So combining these two ideas, I think the problem is that the way in which you frame technological progress, it should be also appealing to women. And I think you can frame it in ways that are appealing to women or not appealing to women. So for example, let's take the example of pharmaceutical companies. One can talk about the fact that pharma companies are greedy and antisocial and want to charge people too much. And maybe since women on average are a bit more pro-social, maybe that will make women more dislike pharma companies more than men. But you can also talk about how pharma companies have advanced our, ability to treat children, to treat the people, like, the average life expectancy of people with cystic fibrosis has increased from 4 to 44 in the last few decades, which is amazing. So I think that the sort of pro-social role of progress has been very underplayed in mainstream media. And I think that has particularly made women maybe less interested in progress. And I see like this emergent progress movement that is in large part dominated by men, and maybe they use like justifications for it or aesthetics for it that are likely to appeal primarily to other men, like maybe saying like, oh, we need to go to Mars because we need to conquer Mars. And we all know boys who like to play with toys and conquer and be soldiers or whatever. I don't think women will be as excited about going to Mars, but I don't think they need to be as excited about going to Mars because there's so many things about progress that are naturally appealing to women, like the curing people from cystic fibrosis. So I really think that because women are very pivotal in like cultural movements and propagating culture, because it's good for sexes to understand and like each other and have somewhat similar views, we need to include women. And the way to do so is to sort of present the aesthetics of progress in a way that is appealing to them.
Ruxandra Teslo, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to The Good Fight. In the rest of this week's conversation, Ruxandra and I talked about how to assess how you're having impact in the world, whether writing is a sensible way of trying to influence the world, and how more broadly to assess whether Barack Obama, whether Elon Musk, whether major figures of our time have had a positive or negative impact. The conversation is at once very practical and quite philosophical. If you want to have access to it, please go now to yaschamounk.substack.com, become a paying subscriber, and set up your private feed of the podcast.
Thank you so much for listening to The Good Fight. Lots of listeners have been spreading the word about the show. If you too have been enjoying the podcast, please be like, rate the show on iTunes, tell your friends all about it, share it on Facebook or Twitter. And finally, please mail suggestions for great guests or comments about the show to goodfightpod@gmail.com. That's goodfightpod@gmail.com.
This recording carries a Creative Commons 4.0 international license. Thanks to Silent Partner for their song, Chess Pieces.